keep on talking, I would ask Shashi Tharoor to come over and take the
Good afternoon, everyone, and profound apologies. First of all, Mr. Raju, K. Raju ji, Amrita Dhawan ji, Mr. Venkat, the President of the State's NSUI, students, faculty, dear friends. I can't tell you how delighted I am to be here at the University of Hyderabad and with you all. And I really do want to apologize about the delay. It started with air traffic congestion above Hyderabad airport, which delayed the flight by 40 minutes. We actually would have been on time. We took off on time. But then we were circling around waiting to be allowed to land. Then the absolutely wonderful traffic you have in the city, which I'm sure is a sign of prosperity and economic growth. But that again meant that our final journey from the hotel to the campus was a crawl, and sometimes not even a crawl. And then when I got to the gates of the university, I was surprised to find a rather significant group of people who had not been allowed into the campus. This was astonishing to me, so I got out of the car and I inquired what the problem was. Apparently there are some restrictions on who can come into the campus. There was an 80-year-old writer with his walking stick who wanted to present me one of his books and get my autograph on my book and talk to me and listen to me talking about education. But alas, he was not allowed in. His equally not youthful wife was waiting outside in the hot sun. There were other individuals who were visibly not students. But I have never heard of a university that closes its doors to outsiders who wish to come in and imbibe the atmosphere of ideas and learning on a campus. I must say, I think it's sad and deplorable, and I apologize to you all that I spent a few minutes with them before coming here, because they would have been in the audience with you had they been allowed to enter. And then before coming into the auditorium, Raju ji and I and Amrita ji and Venkat, we had an opportunity to garland the statue of your illustrious colleague, fellow student who lost his life, Rohit Vemula. That was a tragedy that shook the nation. It was one that I know many of you have already thought about, discussed. I will not belabor the issue, but it is nonetheless, I think, striking that one of your fellow students, perhaps some of you have had coffees with the young man, has become a symbol across the country of the need for openness and liberalism in our education system, for an end to discrimination and discriminatory practices, and for the kind of freedom that K. Raju ji has just spoken so passionately about, which all of us would like to believe we have grown up taking for granted in our universities. I bow my head in silent tribute to Rohit Vemula. Now, I've been asked to talk today about educational policies, which I know is a somewhat dry and academic subject. I'll try and cover it at least in its essence so that we can have some time for an interaction with all of you and take your questions directly on that or broader subjects. And I'm told that with an election going on in the city right now, there is a code of conduct in place and certain restraints and so on. So I fully appreciate all that, and I will stick in my remarks to you all to the topic of education in India's future. It's a subject that, as you can imagine, I've thought a fair deal about and I've written about. Some of you who would like a more detailed exposition of my views on some of these topics are invited to read the relevant chapters in my book, India Shastra, where I have tried to spell out in some detail what I believe needs to be done. I have been concerned about education before I was given an opportunity by Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and the UPA government to play a small role in it myself as Minister of State for Human Resource Development in the last government. I want to start off with a caveat that first of all, it was only 13 months that I was in that office before the General Elections Code of Conduct kicked in, so there was only a limited amount of time that we could accomplish much at that time. And then, as I joked not too long ago, don't ever expect too much from a Minister of State, because being a Minister of State in the government of India is rather like standing in a cemetery. There are lots of people under you, but nobody's listening. So I just want to stress that some of my critiques will immediately prompt some of you to say, well, you were minister, why didn't you do something about it? So for those two reasons, the extent and limits of my authority, as well as the amount of time available, the critiques I'm going to make are critiques that I did make in office, both behind closed doors and as appropriate in public forums. So let me start off by saying that I believe that our educational system is overregulated and undergoverned. We have too many rules and regulations. We have too much of an emphasis on control from the top, on uniformity, as Amrita has also pointed out, where we have an apex institution in the UGC and the MHRD that presumes to tell universities across the country what kind of syllabus they can teach, how many years their course must last, what the size of their classroom should be, how many students they can have, what the size of their playgrounds, how many toilets, God knows what else, but seem least concerned about the learning outcomes of the educational experience. So that you may have a university that ticks all the right boxes imposed by the regulators, but which actually does not provide the kind of quality education that all of you go to university campuses looking for. Now, this is not a critique of any specific university. I'm very aware that there are excellent universities in this country, and of course you are all in a university that K. Rajaji points out he graduated from and got into the IAS from. So clearly there are institutions which at least at one time have offered a considerable amounts of learning and quality. But at the same time, the self-imposed handicap we have of a dearth of quality institutions means that these institutions that I am referring to were essentially islands of excellence in a sea of mediocrity. And this sea of mediocrity is what worries me, because if democracy means anything, it is that we must offer the benefits of a quality education to all our people, and not only to a privileged few, even if it is not a privilege of money, if it is only that those who have the ability are the ones who get the education, still to have only a few good students coming out of the best institutions, and so many others being condemned to indifferent teaching, ramshackle structures, and inadequate university ecosystems. That is something that I believe would be wrong for a democracy, and especially from the point of view of those of us who, shall we say, are in our own ways connected to the NSUI. We believe very much in equality of opportunity for students across the country. So, to my mind, this is not to decry the excellent institutions that do exist. We know, for example, that today the brand name IIT is spoken of in America with the same reverence that MIT used to be spoken of at one time. And that that's because of the extremely good students coming out of an institution like that, who perhaps our own economy could not absorb them or offer them enough challenges, and they went off to America, and now 40% of the startups in Silicon Valley were started by Indian engineering graduates, or at least as members of the group. And their education here, the solid grounding they had, did hold them in good stead, because we all know an Indian invented the Pentium chip, another Indian invented Hotmail, the world's first free email service, another Indian co-founded Sun Microsystems, and with all of this, the excellence that came out of our institutions points to the fact that there's nothing wrong either with Indian brains or with the ability of those Indian brains to make the most out of the educational opportunities awarded to them. But at the same time, we all know that there aren't that many of them. The UPA government did try to expand. I remember complaining that when I went off to graduate school in the United States in 1975, the population of this country was under 600 million, and we had 5 IITs. And when after decades, in fact 3 decades of working at the United Nations and so on, I came back to India, I found there were only 7 IITs, even though our population had doubled. And I would have thought that by then we should have had at least 15. Well, our government did try to do something about that, and in the last government we actually created more IITs, but the name alone is not enough. We need to make sure that these IITs live up to the quality of the original ones, and that means having adequate faculty of quality, and being able to have the kind of infrastructure that gives the students the learning environment they need to be able to truly benefit from an IIT education. We haven't got there yet. Now, yes, there are a few good regional engineering colleges too. I don't only want to single out the IITs. Mr. Narayana Murthy will never let us forget that he came out of a regional engineering college and he founded perhaps India's most successful IT company. So the fact is that there are institutions of quality and some students of quality everywhere, but overall, I'm sorry to say, and I say this having spoken to a number of employers in our economy, there is a perception that too many of our students are simply not ready for prime time. They come out of the institutions unequipped or ill-equipped to take on the responsibilities of applying their learning to a serious work environment. And as a result, companies like Tata, Infosys, Wipro, and so on have essentially set up universities of their own. They have set up campuses which look like universities. I've been to the Infosys campus in Mysore. It looks like some sort of American university. And what they do is they hire people who have already got their degrees, but they decide to teach them what they should have learned in university and haven't. And very often that means that if you join a company like Infosys, you get an extra year's university education, but in a university they control and run. That, I think, is a rather savage indictment of our educational system and the quality of the graduates we're coming up with. Now, the irony is that we are one of the world's largest higher education systems in the world. We are second in the world in terms of student enrollment. So we're not exactly a small system, but it's not enough just to look at numbers. It's also important to look, as I said, at percentages and at quality, and I'll come to that in a minute. But I want to frame this discussion of educational policy around 4 basic principles that I think are worth mentioning, and I've given you the context in my opening remarks that explains why these 4 matter. And these are what I call the 4 E's of education. Education itself is an E, but I'm not counting that. And the 4 E's are those of expansion, equity, excellence, and the 4th one that I personally added to the catechism, employability. And I mention this because we know that today the Minister of HRD, Mr. Javadekar, is working on a new education policy. He did hold one consultation with MPs, which I attended, gave my comments and thoughts, but no one has seen the actual text of a policy. All we have is bits and pieces floating around. Eventually, when the policy is officially released by the government, it goes to the Standing Committee on HRD in Parliament. So we're nowhere near creating a policy. But some of the things that I'm going to talk to you about this morning, this afternoon, are the kinds of things I believe should be in such a policy. So why, let's take those 4 E's. Why expansion? I know that some of you are aware that I've just published a book called An Era of Darkness, the British Empire in India. And there is a short section there on education. The British had absolutely no interest in educating Indians. They made it clear that that was not a good use of British money. They were here to take as much as they could out of India, not to spend too much here. And so the policy of education going back to the early 19th century was only to educate a thin crust of people. And the famous or notorious minute on education by Lord Macaulay, there is the line that he wanted to create a class of Indians Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect, quote unquote. And this class was to serve as a sort of interpreter class between the British and the people they governed. And the objective was that they should have enough education to be of use to the British in facilitating their administrative control of India, but there was no interest on the part of the British in educating the larger mass of Indians. In fact, as late as 1930, the American scholar Will Durant, visiting India, found that the entire total expense on education, from the lowest levels to the highest university in British India, the total expense was less than half the budget for high school education in the state of New York. Can you imagine the state of New York and the size of India? In 1930, this was the reality. So it's not surprising that when the British left in 1947, they left us with a pathetic literacy rate of under 17%. They left us with women essentially unable to read and write. 8.9% of Indian women could read and write. 1 out of every 12 and a half women. Put 13 women in a room, you'd be lucky to find one who could read and write. That was the condition of our literacy in this country. At that time, there were barely 30 universities in the country and about 700 colleges, with an enrollment of, a total enrollment in 1947 of just about 4 lakh students, 400,000 students. What successive governments of India have done is to therefore expand this, and I'm very proud of the vision of our first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, who focused heavily on this and took us to the point we are today of about 74% literacy, over 20 million students in higher education. That's about 2 crore students instead of 4 lakh. Over 650 universities in the country and 35,000 colleges. And even these numbers are probably getting out of date since I last checked them, because we are expanding and continue to expand. And that, I think, is very important. The whole logic behind the UPA's right to education was the logic that we needed to expand our reach. Not only do we need to expand further at the top, which is what I've just been talking about, but also at the bottom, because 2/3 of the world's unschooled children were in India. These are people, little kids, who had never seen the inside of a schoolroom, and what a terrible waste of potential and talent that was. So we needed to get them in, and therefore, by making it the responsibility of the state through the RTE Act to get those children into school. In the old days, if your child wasn't in school, it was the fault of the parents. Under the RTE, if the child is in school, it's the fault of the state government. And so the pressure is on the authorities to enroll everybody. Plus we have things like the midday meal scheme, which serve as an incentive to children of poorer families to come in. And the result, of course, is that we've been able to get far more children into school. There is something, a term that educationists like to use, called GER. Not GRE, which some of you may be taking in a couple of years. The GER is the gross enrollment ratio. And that is, you take the people of a particular age group for a particular phase of study, and you see what percentage of people in that age group are enrolled. So, for example, at the university level, our gross enrollment ratio is about 20%. So 20% of the Indians who are at university going age are actually in university. 80% are not. That's not good. Our government wants to push that up to at least 30%, though the global average is growing higher. Now, what's interesting is that in primary education, thanks to the RTE, we now have a gross enrollment ratio of 104%, which means there are actually more children than we thought were available to get into the school system. But the reason is, of course, that some who had previously missed the net have now been brought in. And this is a very, very impressive thing. But the problem is the dropout rate. So you put kids into school, but by class 8, that GER drops to just 69%. In class 11 and 12, it's only 39%. Which means that by class 11 and 12, 61% of our children are no longer studying at all, anything. That's really not good for our society. And the truth is that, that when we come to college, the GER of 20% is well below the global average of about 30, which, as I said to you, is growing higher. So there's a great deal that still remains to be done on the expansion front. We can be proud of expansion so far, but it's not enough. The second is equity. And on equity, I do want to say that the painful history of our country, of millennia of a stratified and fractured social structure along caste and religious lines, exacerbated, as my book demonstrates, by British colonial rule, have left wounds across the body and soul of our nation, which has affected the system of education too. Coupled, of course, with the gap between haves and have-nots in our society. Now, as the tragedy of Rohit Vemula reminds us, we also have a long way to go, because there are battles still to be fought, and there are battles that are being fought and in some cases lost by those whom our system is supposed to be working for. But the fact is that equity still remains a major objective of our educational process. And as far as, again, the previous government, the UPA government, which I had the privilege to serve, is concerned, we did actually make a fair amount of progress in equity. That is trying to create a more broad-based system in which people of all sorts of backgrounds could come in and join us. I, for example, made one of my crusades, one of the things I could do as minister was speak a lot, and I did that, about educating girls. I really think that it's the closest thing to a magic bullet in development. Because there are numerous studies around the world, in Africa, in other parts of Asia, and so on, that if you educate a girl, you actually transform, in many, many ways, the entire society. I know it sounds like a cliche to say it, but I think Mahatma Gandhi had said it first, that if you educate a boy, that's a good thing. A boy is a person, and we're glad he's getting an education. But if you educate a girl, you actually do, through her, educate a family, and through the family, transform the community and the society. And that's because even a girl who just has 5-6 years of education is in every respect more productive, more empowered, knows everything from the importance of, say, boiling water before she gives it to her child or her family to drink, to the importance of other sanitary practices, to the importance of spacing her children, the importance of educating her children. Don't forget, every child, male or female, in any class of society, in the first few years, their formative years, they spend more time with their mother than with any other human being on earth. And that person, therefore, if that mother is educated, even modestly educated, the impact she has on the child as well is colossal. So it's really a hugely important issue. Third, excellence. And excellence, I think, is one thing where we can probably be accused of having faltered. We did well on the expansion front. We did well on the equity front, reasonably well, in that despite the tragedy of Rohit Vemula and so on, by and large, our universities are accessible to people of every kind of conceivable social background. But at the end of the day, what were the learning outcomes coming out of our schools, coming out of our universities? They weren't good enough. And what worries me is the number of CEOs in studies conducted by industry and trade bodies like FICCI, ASSOCHAM, CII, saying that a very large percentage of our graduates are unemployable. That really worries me. And you know, one of the curious things, for example, is that on the one hand, we're producing a lot of graduates. As I told you, we have one of the largest systems of education in terms of student enrollment in the world. On the other hand, if those graduates haven't learned anything worth learning and employers don't want them, what do? And we're also producing them into a system that doesn't know how to absorb them. I'll give you one sad example. Last year, the Madhya Pradesh Police Department advertised 14,000 posts of constables. Do you know how many candidates applied? Anyone follow the news? 9 lakh candidates applied for 14,000 posts of constables. Now, constable requires basically a class 10 education. Who were these applicants? 10,000 engineering graduates applied, 12 PhD holders applied, 1,90,000 regular graduates, and 15,000 postgraduates, all applied for the job of constable in the Madhya Pradesh Police Department because they couldn't find anything else. They couldn't have any other job. We are clearly releasing undereducated graduates into the educational ecosystem, and the employment system of our country doesn't know how to use them. Some 60% of engineers, this is a serious study, 60% of India's engineering graduates are estimated to end up in jobs that do not require an engineering degree. So we boast about producing 500,000 engineers every year. But what's the point if they didn't actually need that study? What a colossal waste of resources in many, many ways. And I'm not even counting those engineers who get no jobs at all. So the systematic skill mismatch between qualifications and jobs is a serious issue. And then, of course, part of the problem is simply not doing enough, in my view, to encourage excellent learning outcomes. And finally, the fourth one that I focused on is employability, because of the reasons I gave you. The truth is that when you look at employability, you are looking at a crucial determinant for our country's national security as well. Because when we look at the great demographic dividend that we're talking about in India, where so many people in our population are young people, and that the potential for their success comes from the very numbers alone. The ILO, the International Labour Organization, has estimated that in the job starting age group of 19 to 23, by 2020 we will have an astonishing 116 million young people, whereas China will only have 94 million young people of the same age group in 2020.